Hello, Pulse Nation. Richard Garner here, host of A Third Way podcast, season 2 coming in 2022. Also, regular contributor here on all things media at The Pulse. I have some breaking news for you. Guess who's back? That's right, the pandemic prophet, the oracle of Omicron. None other than that petulant punk, that nerd we used to hate, but now we apparently love, Bill Gates. He's on a book tour, no less. Well, obviously you're surprised. I would imagine you would be, because how could somebody who's got a history like, well, let's go through the recent history of, fanboy to Jeffrey Epstein, inappropriate sexual harassment boss at Microsoft, philandering former husband of Melinda Gates. That got most people Me Too'd and ended over the last 3-4 years, not to mention the baggage he carried with him from his days at Microsoft as the ruthless Bond villain himself, the petulant punk of the infamous deposition. If you've never seen it, stop this video and go watch it on YouTube right now. So remember, this guy was a universally disliked, monopolistic, capitalist, predatory business person who was sued around the world, the EU, the US, for antitrust, monopolistic business practice, reviled by left-wing media across the board, and then cut to, even though he didn't leave Microsoft to pursue a career of philanthropy with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as it was ultimately positioned. No, as we found out through the divorce with Melinda Gates, that in fact, Bill was pushed out by the board at Microsoft because they were investigating an affair he had with an employee while working there, while married to Melinda. So, how much have you heard about that? Probably not a lot. So you'd be forgiven if you thought a guy like that, with that track record, has no chance to be rehabilitated in the public. Well, you'd be wrong. So how do you ultimately come back from that and become that deified Omicron oracle that is Bill Gates? Well, you do it through the old-fashioned way. You hire a PR firm and you put together a strategy over some time to bring you back to public prominence. And in this case, you don't really need the best PR team in the world, because you have the establishment media and friends like Anderson Cooper at CNN, which is where we take this story now.
A lot to get to regarding the pandemic, but since we last spoke, there's obviously been a lot of reporting about more personal topics, and they may impact the foundation. So I want to just ask you a couple of questions about that. And I know you feel some things have been misreported, so I'll just start there. Obviously, in May, you and your wife, Melinda, announced you were ending your marriage after 27 years. On Monday, this week, the divorce was finalized. Just on a personal level, how are you doing?
On a personal level, how are you doing? This is how you start the interview with a guy that's been accused of being within Jeffrey Epstein's layers multiple times and again, harassing women in the workplace at Microsoft. This is how how are you? Are you okay, Bill? I mean, if that doesn't give you an idea of where this is going to go, well, you could probably predict what the sort of tone of the next clip is, but have a listen.
There's a couple of things of reporting that have been out there I want to ask you about, and I think it's no one's business what happens in a person's marriage. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal both reported in recent months that Melinda was concerned about a relationship you had with Jeffrey Epstein, who at the time you met him in 2011 had been already convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor. The Times reported she hired divorce attorneys around the time in October 2019 when that contact with Epstein became public. Can you explain your relationship with Epstein? Did you have any concerns? Was there ever any concerns you had about it?
I don't think it's anyone's business what happens in someone's marriage. Really, Anderson? So you're telling me this would have been exactly your same line of questioning for, I don't know, if this interview was with, let's say, Donald Trump? Come on, man.
There's been reporting about workplace behavior in the past. The New York Times reported 6 women from Microsoft, the company you created, your foundation, and the financial firm that manages your fortune said but your behavior at times created an uncomfortable workplace environment. I know a spokeswoman for you acknowledged you had an affair 20 years ago with a Microsoft employee that she said ended amicably. Do you have regrets?
Notice how he uses the words workplace behavior. Like he's trying to soften this as like, it's almost like that locker room talk thing with Trump and the Access Hollywood video, trying to come up with a softer way of describing something, workplace behavior versus sexual harassment. And then imagine that Cooper goes out of his way to say this.
Well, just on a personal level, I'm sorry for what you and your family are going through.
What the hell is going on, man? He is interviewing a guy about sexual harassment, hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, who is a convicted sex offender. And he wants to, like, mid-interview, reassure Bill that, you know, he has empathy for him. You couldn't write this stuff. So there you have, you know, step one, let's say, of the media tour. The rehabilitation tour, the redemption tour of Bill Gates, thanks to, again, our friends at AC 360. So he goes on, he pops in and out of a couple of interviews here and there, very carefully selected, all friendly fire for the most part. And of course, somebody would have decided in the boardroom where or war room when they were planning all this a year ago, Bill, you need to write a book. And not only, you're not going to write a book about you, you're not going to write a book about your personal life, you're going to write a book about what we want to get everybody's attention back to, that you're the pandemic prophet. So you write a book about the fears of the next pandemic. What's better? And it allows the media to say, well, that's really important. So we got to give him a pass because, you know, Bill's the, you know, again, Omicron Oracle. He's the pandemic prophet. If you thought the Anderson Cooper interview was something, well, ladies and gentlemen, Savannah Guthrie said, hold my beer.
Bill Gates co-founded Microsoft nearly 50 years ago at the forefront of the computer age that changed the world. And since then, he's been using the fortune that earned him to change the world. The Gates Foundation giving away tens of billions of dollars over the past decade. He also famously predicted the world was unprepared for a pandemic in a 2015 TED Talk that was unfortunately accurate and has been viewed now 43 million times. Well, he's sounding the alarm again this morning. His new book, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic, is out today. It's also been a year of upheaval in his own life after he and Melinda, his wife of 27 years, announced their divorce 1 year ago today. So, Bill, we have so much to catch up on. It's good to see you. Good morning.
So, yes, like her colleague Anderson, she starts off the interview with, Bill, how are you? You know, are you okay? Like a mental wellness check? Like, are you joking? So you can only imagine what the tone of this interview is going to be. And I do encourage you to go watch the full, like, 11 and a half minutes to really see it for your very, like, your very, through your very own eyes, because it's really a wonder. Like, I was just gobsmacked, not just the questions, not just the tone, her body language and laughing and clearly conveying to the audience that this is a good person, that this is a person you should like. And, you know, it reminds me of when Fallon had Trump on, you know, whatever it was a few years back. And he ended up asking Trump if he could muss his hair. Trump said yes, he did it. Everybody laughed. And Fallon got vilified for humanizing Trump because instead he should have been very, you know, serious and condemning him and whatever. And instead he allowed this person to bask in the sunlight of humanization. Well, this is exactly what she's doing here with Bill Gates. She's demonstrating to the audience that this is a guy you should trust. This is a guy you should forgive. And look at the body language here. As you can see, she's sitting across from Bill in a very, like, warm, welcoming way on this wide shot. And look at how they have Bill Gates dressed. So the sweater, his little khakis. He's supposed to look like the mix between a child that was bad and an uncle who said some crazy stuff, but he's an old guy, so you got to forgive him. But let's get back to his pearls of wisdom that he's dropping as the pandemic prophet.
There's something strangely optimistic about this book. You've got a whole bunch of ideas on how to actually prevent the next pandemic. One idea, you compare it to firefighters. We need kind of a global firefighting team that's ready to find the next pandemic and respond to it. How would it work?
Well, in firefighting, we're all trained to know that, there's the exit. The U.S. alone has over 300,000 full-time firefighters. So we take it seriously because if one house burns down, it can, affect an entire community. Pandemics are even worse, and we didn't practice. We weren't ready to go. A few countries that were more ready, like Australia, have 10% the deaths that we have. So the debate about exactly how to invest in that preparedness now is the right time, even though we're still trying to get out of this one.
And you wonder why people believe that this guy is part of a bigger agenda. Look at how he casually just inserts Australia there as the example of how you can best prepare for a pandemic, not mentioning at all the dystopian overreach that was a complete bulldozing of people's rights in Australia on the level of what's going on right now in Shanghai. No, he doesn't mention that at all. He doesn't mention people being the crazy lockdowns, etc. And then he has the nerve, the audacity to make a comparison, a direct comparison between the amount of deaths in Australia and the US. Doesn't mention it per capita. He says Australia had less deaths than the US. So as a journalist, you would think Savannah Guthrie follows that up with, well, wait a sec, Bill. Australia is like 26 million people and the US is 330 million people. So obviously they would have way less death. No, doesn't say anything. Just lets Bill continue to sort of bulldoze and go in the direction that he wants. And then, of course, they want to talk about misinformation.
But let's talk about misinformation, because that has been a hallmark, unfortunately, of this pandemic. President Biden rather famously said last July that misinformation on social media is killing people.
Really? You at NBC are going to talk about misinformation. And of course, where does that lead? That leads to the next phase of the rehabilitation part of this interview is you put up Bill Gates against a relatively comparable person, but allowing Bill Gates to be the good guy and this person to be the villain. Well, who do you ask about? Guess who?
Elon Musk just recently announced moves to acquire Twitter. I wonder if you are concerned about the proliferation of misinformation, given some of his views about expanding what he refers to as free speech on Twitter, and what you think of the acquisition.
And like her colleague Anderson Cooper, she's got to get to the tough stuff, of course, that she pushed to the end of the interview about after promoting his book and elevating him to guru status on everything from pandemics to vaccines to, I guess, I don't know, how the universe was formed. Well, she is a journalist after all. They do have to ask him the tough stuff. This is how she starts that process of asking Bill the tough questions.
Well, let's talk about you personally. It's been a period of transition. It was actually 1 year ago today that you and your wife, Melinda, filed for divorce. How have you been coming to terms with this?
And like her colleague Anderson Cooper at AC360, she starts off the tough part of the interview with, Bill, how you doing? Where am I here?
Frankly, there were allegations of extramarital affairs, and when she was asked about that in the interview, she said that is a question that Bill needs to answer.
And of course, here's his canned answer that has zero follow-up or zero challenge.
So here you are now. Did that happen? Were you unfaithful in your marriage? Is that one of the reasons there was a divorce?
I certainly made mistakes, and I take responsibility. I don't think delving into the particulars at this point is constructive, but yes, I caused pain, and I feel terrible about that.
If I live to be 1,000, I don't know if I'll ever see a more blatant, transparent, frankly, gross example of non-journalism, puff piece, Entertainment Tonight level media interviewing than Savannah Guthrie going out of her way to pivot from the uncomfortable stuff about Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Gates hanging around with a convicted sex offender and going out of her way to set him up with.
Finally, on this topic, you recently gave an interview and you said you'd marry Melinda all over again. She says you guys are friendly, not necessarily friends, but friendly. How do you see the relationship moving forward?
Like, she almost said, oh, and allowing him to again be humanized, to look emotional as the bookend to this interview, so that again, the stuff in the middle is what people forget. What they leave with is that Bill Gates is credible, he's important, he's a trustworthy source of health information that's going to protect us and our world going forward from not only future pandemics, but everything else, climate crisis, what else? And that in the end, did he make some mistakes? Did he, well, he says he learned from these mistakes. And he said they were examples of bad judgment, and then he wants to move forward. So obviously that's exactly how the media should treat him. This, my friends, is an example of how the establishment media says one thing and does another, says they care about certain issues, but then if that person is on their team, not only do they not bring them down and cancel them and end them, they actually work on their behalf to elevate them, rehabilitate them, and redeem them.